Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Null, and I'd like to welcome you to this program. I'm broadcasting and video streaming live from our studios in New York City. This is the Progressive Commentary Hour. Each week at this time, we take one issue, a serious issue that is generally not discussed in any depth and certainly not with objectivity by the mainstream or even the alternative media. Today, the topic is AIDS and the drugs used to treat persons diagnosed with AIDS-defined illnesses. I have a large panel, including Celia Farber, an award-winning journalist who has covered the HIV wars extensively since 1987 in various publications. Some of these writings are collected in her book, Serious Adverse Events, An Uncensored History of AIDS, published by Melville House Press, now Random House. Also, activist Michael Callan has called Farber the best AIDS journalist in the world. She'll be joined by Clark Baker. Clark is a retired officer with the LAPD in Los Angeles who left in 2000 to become an independent writer and private investigator. He is now the founder of the Office of Medical and Scientific Justice in Southern California, which spearheads the investigations into the politics and fraud of various medical-related groups and individuals, including the pro-AIDS industry and academia. Clark serves on the board of the Semmelweis Society International, a foundation that awards individuals for their scientific independence in innovative research and critical thought in the absence of vested interest. He's written extensively on his investigations into the activities of the pro-HIV community. And the website is the Office of Medical and Scientific Justice, is omsj.org. Also today, if we're able to connect with Dr. Duesberg, is Professor Peter Duesberg. He is Professor of Molecular and Cell Biology at the University of California at Berkeley. He was the first to isolate a cancer gene through his work with retroviruses back in the 1970s and mapped the genetic structure of this class of viruses. His work in retrovirus research awarded him an election to the National Academy of Sciences and outstanding investigative grants from the National Institutes of Health. Based upon his knowledge of retroviruses, he has been at the forefront in challenging the virus HIV hypothesis and is published in the world's leading medical journals. As a consequence, Dr. Duesberg's hypothesis has won support from many scientists who've been outcast from the publishing world because of their views, including Nobel laureates such as Kary Mullis, inventor of the PCR technology. Earlier today, an hour ago, I finished an interview with Dr. Christian Fiala. Now, he is in Vienna, Austria, and because of the time difference, he asked could he be recorded earlier. Because of the extensive information he has on AIDS in Africa, since he lived in Africa and in Thailand and worked with persons with AIDS, and because he is board certified as a gynecologist and obstetrician, has published in peer-reviewed literature, is an academic, and has written a very important book about AIDS in this area. I have recorded him separately. To listen to that full-hour interview, you'll have to go to our archives, and it's posted there now, so you can hear the first hour here, the second hour over the archives. Let's begin by saying hello to at least two of our panelists who are standing by, Celia and Clark. Nice to have you both with us.
Great to be here, Gary.
Great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
We're going to begin with you, Celia, and let's begin by taking a look at the current status of the drugs used to treat persons diagnosed with AIDS. Tell us what you know about these drugs, and then give us a history lesson in the use of drugs such as AZT, which was the first patented popular drug, was the drug of choice that millions of people worldwide have used, and the reality behind the safety and efficacy of that drug.
Whew. I will do my best. Gary, we're in now the era of, I think it was Charles Ortlib, publisher of the New York Native, who coined the term psychotic medicine. And I say psychotic because we thought we had trouble back in the 80s and the 90s, when the only problem was giving highly toxic drugs for people who are already immune suppressed, highly toxic, rapidly approved, fraud in the trials and so forth. You know all that, and probably many of your listeners do too. What we could never have anticipated was that despite it going down in real bona fide history, agreed by both sides of this war, that AZT was, which was the first drug approved by the FDA against HIV, that it was spectacularly deadly and is estimated to have killed, this is a suspiciously even number, but I've heard 300,000. Despite that, there followed no period of reassessment or sobriety. Instead, after AZT fell with the Concord study in 1993, fell from grace kind of with a whimper. They admitted it wasn't saving lives. They admitted it was shortening lives, and we thought that would be the end of that. We thought it was the Berlin Wall moment. Not at all. I'm going to read you a quote from a researcher quoted in the New York Times when the inventor of AZT, Jerome Horowitz, died, and this is a 2012 quote from the New York Times. Speaking of AZT, still to this day as a life-saving drug, and saying it's impossible to estimate how many lives have been saved by this drug, this AIDS researcher says, quote, they form, meaning AZT and similar compounds, form the basis for the antiviral therapy we use today. So what they did was kind of like the petrochemical industry after World War II. What are we going to do with all this stuff, right? We got to put it in the food supply or something. So they took AZT and they started putting it in combination therapy drugs. Then we had the explosion of the mania about protease inhibitors, with AZT still not falling from grace but being reincorporated into these cocktails. And today we have upward of, I don't know if it's 32, 36, 42 anti-HIV drugs in the protease inhibitor category, but it gets worse. When I say psychotic medicine, here's what I mean. And I consider all of that psychotic too, but it got worse this past year with the advent of medicating the HIV negative population. It's just breathtaking. Truvada is the drug that they marketed to everybody's astonishment as a kind of quasi-vaccination against unsafe sex and transmitting HIV. So I don't want to be depressing, but it is depressing. It seems to me, looking out at this, as though we haven't lost the war, but it's very difficult to know how to feel when it just gets crazier and crazier. And with that, I want to say the only bright light in terms of fighting this madness in the courts where the fight has to happen is the work of Clark Baker and OMSJ, and that's a very bright light. So
all right, we're going to go there
now and pass it over to him.
We're going to go there in a little bit, but we have Peter Duisberg on the phone now. Nice to have you with us today.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I just recognized Celia's voice.
Yes, Celia's here.
She's complaining about AIDS medications. What does she want?
And
still complaining.
Yeah.
We also have
so many nice things. And Obama pays for it, doesn't he?
Yeah. Dr. Christian Fiala, also from Vienna, Austria, and Clark Baker. I'm going to ask you a question that will probably take a little bit of time to answer, but please don't give us a brief answer. Give us a definitive answer on this. We've been led to believe that a single retrovirus is responsible for 30 different conditions that we call AIDS collectively. All of these conditions had existed as individual medical conditions before they were lumped under the term AIDS. Now, as a retrovirologist, as a molecular biologist, as someone who has studied these in infinite detail, I would like for you to address, is it possible, let alone probable, that a single retrovirus could cause the devastation that we see in persons diagnosed or suffering from AIDS-related conditions? That's the first issue. And the second is, at the beginning of this whole movement, we were told that it's sexually transmitted and that it's also infectious. Therefore, everyone in the country should be tested, no matter if you were celibate and had never had sex, or whether you're completely healthy. Everybody was equally susceptible. That was the original statements, but we saw it was really only in intravenous drug users, most of whom were Caucasian, fast-track gays, and in some of the hemophiliacs. So tell us what we were told. Explain to us if those initial statements ever were able to be supported by fact, and then what is AIDS if it's not due to these conditions and if it's not what we were told. The form is yours.
Is it Christian Fiala or Duisberg? No. Who is speaking?
You, Peter. It's your turn.
Oh, me. Okay. So yes, I mean the greatest discrepancy so far is it was supposed to be a new viral epidemic or new epidemic virus, and viruses spread essentially randomly. Certainly, sexually transmitted viruses would not be restricted to hemophiliacs and male homosexuals. It's not their prerogative to have sex. We get 4 to 5 million babies per year before AIDS, during AIDS, and now. In fact, it's getting more rather than less. And there is no AIDS epidemic anywhere on this planet among heterosexuals who have at least 4.5 million times unprotected sex in this country, which is the best and best controlled and best medicated and best everything. And still, there are all these babies, and there's no AIDS epidemic, not in 27 years. That's not the sign of an infectious viral epidemic. Nowhere. Syphilis is still there, gonorrhea is there, chlamydia is there, but no AIDS epidemic. So that doesn't work out as a viral epidemic. And now, with your question about the 30 diseases. How would one virus cause 30 diseases? It would indeed be a highly sophisticated virus. All the viruses that we know from 100 years of germ theory, as this is called, or searching after microbes and viruses, have typically very narrow pathogenic spectrum. They can do very little. Their IQ, their intelligence, their information is minute in biology, as small as it can get, like HIV. 9 kilobases, that's 3 million less than we are, which is not the highest IQ possible either, but still, it's quite a bit more. So here's a virus like with 9 kilobases, the size of polio or flu or herpes. Well, herpes is even much bigger. And all they can do is, all these other guys, if they can do anything, is one specific disease. They're specialists, let's say, for the liver, and you get hepatitis. Or they go to the lung and you get a flu. But here's one that has no more information and is said to cause vastly different diseases. Some of them have nothing to do with infectious diseases at all, like dementia, or Kaposi sarcoma. There's no microbe that causes the cancer, or weight loss. All of this in the presence of no virus. That's totally unprecedented. There's no evidence that a virus ever causes a disease only, I'm emphasizing only, after it is neutralized by antibodies, which we call a positive AIDS test, HIV test, and at a time when we cannot detect it in a dying or in a suffering AIDS patient by any method, any direct method. We cannot find virus. All we can find is antibody against it. And for 200 years, doctors and microbiologists and immunologists were in agreement that the only protection against viruses would be these antibodies. Because once you have these antibodies, the virus is literally paralyzed. The antibodies work against viruses truly like miracles. That's the popularity of vaccination. Once you have it, you're done with it for the rest of your life. Mostly. I mean, there are exceptions, but typically that's the end of the virus. When an antibody hangs on it, it can't get into the cell anymore. And now the only time when HIV is said to cause all these horrible fatal diseases is after it is neutralized by antibody. And nobody can find it anymore. That if that were true, we would have Nobel Prizes coming for chemistry, for logic, for physics, for microbiology, for anything we know in science, at least I know in science. You can get an effect only for a substantial or probable cause. Something that is gone and neutralized and you find only antibody against it is not doing anything anywhere in biology. You see, we have in every single cell, we have all the same cells in our body. But one is a nose and the other is an ass and the other is an eye and the other is an ear. Because different genes are working at the time. Only when these genes work, then we get a phenotype. And here we have a virus that is undetectable by any virological method. You have indirect tests like antibody and say it's doing all these things at once, 30 different diseases. There is no precedent anywhere in biology, microbiology, virology, and immunology that I'm aware of that is proven. I mean, there are claims that we have slow fatigue virus or something like that. When people don't have explanations, they come up with a slow virus or autoimmunity. Those are usually the standbys, and then we start working on it and get nowhere. So that's my take on the chances that HIV is causing AIDS. And it's both epidemiologically and biochemically and molecular biologically, it is totally implausible. And they had now 27 years to figure out how that works under these conditions. And they have nothing to show for themselves. Nothing on that. Only propaganda, medications, and a perfectly working a PR system that excludes any other opinions completely and penalizes them.
All right, let's go to a different aspect here then, segueing from what you said. Just a very brief overview to lead you into it. Back in the 1970s, I was introduced to a gentleman who was one of the leading gay physicians in the United States. He wanted me to help some of his patients and who ended up with massive negative bad bacteria in their bowels. And I was helping with the nutrition. He was giving aqueous vitamin A to help kill syphilis, and which was epidemic at the time. And his name was Stephen Kaeza. And Stephen Kaeza introduced me to a man who said, would I come and do a lecture before a group of healthy vegetarians who were in my audience? I said, sure. So I went, and the room was just, this lecture hall was packed. And I asked him...
Was it in New York, or was that in
No, this was New York City.
In New York City.
And I had worked with Kaeza since about 1975. So now we're up in the 1980s. So I asked everyone, I said, this is after 1984, I said, how many in here are vegetarians? All these hands went up. How many are vegans? How many juice, take supplements, exercise, de-stress? All these hands went up. So I said, how many have had the HIV antibody test? All these hands went up. I said, and how many tested positive? Only 2 hands were up. I then said, well, how many of you have sex? And a lot of it. All these hands went up. So then I said, well, why is it that we're being told that AIDS and HIV are from sexual transmission in the gay community? And this gentleman got up, and he was a professor, and he said, look, he said, are you familiar with the fast-track AIDS? And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not. He said, then you have an education ahead of you. Over the next 2 years, I was introduced to the fast-track gay crowd. And here is the difference. And this is where I'd like for you to lead into your next answer. I visited multiple gay clubs where there was lots of drugs. In fact, it was just tons of drugs. There were bowls of antibiotics where people were taking penicillin, believing they could prevent sexually transmitted diseases. They were using amyl nitrate. Some of the people were having sex up to 22 times a night, one guy, every night of the week. And they were smoking,
they should get
drinking.
Better, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I'm
they were drinking. There was cocaine. There was lots of unprotected anal intercourse. And when I spoke with people, many of them had hepatitis 2 or 3 times diagnosed in a year, syphilis 2 or 3 times. Most of them had herpes, 1, 2, and 6. And most were malnourished. two individuals in particular were school teachers who had just gotten into that scene, and I talked with them regularly, and I saw them over a 2-year period going from that lifestyle that they really enjoyed to where they died. And once they had been diagnosed and they had thrush and they had wasting conditions, and then they were given the antibiotics, then they were given the AZT, and they were wiped out. And yet, here was the American media and the scientific community refusing to acknowledge there was a difference between healthy gays, and that represented probably 97% of the gay population, and this fast-track small group. Similarly, in the heterosexual community, I was counseling heterosexual couples who were using amyl nitrate and drinking and smoking and having a lot of unprotected sex and a lot of sexually transmitted diseases. They had very similar symptoms, but they were getting antibiotics. They weren't diagnosed with AIDS, so they weren't given the AIDS drugs, and they got their health back and overcome the sexually transmitted diseases. And I saw that, and I wrote about that, and I thought it was rather remarkable. But 97% of heterosexuals never participated in the sexual revolution. Most gays didn't either. So why wasn't this ever discussed? Why was it made such a political issue that it all had to happen to this virus? No one wanted to look at the actual, what I considered the real causes, the form majeures.
Are you asking me?
You, Peter.
Yeah. That's a good question, but it's hard to answer. From my point of view, of course, it was relatively easy to understand why my colleagues marched that way. I was part of a very privileged group of scientists in the so-called virus cancer program in the 60s and 70s, up to the 80s. This was a central focus of the National Cancer Institute, that viruses would cause cancer. And we were really the VIPs in that business. We had all the privileges we can get because we were working on possibly the most important virus ever found. If we could prove that viruses cause cancer, we make a vaccine and we would have cured cancer. And that's still the biggest medical problem there is and has been and probably will be for a long time to come. So we looked for viruses that would cause cancer. And the retroviruses, as HIV, were the preferred choice because this type of virus doesn't kill cells. Many other viruses, typically most other viruses kill cells to make a living or replicate in them. They are predators in a sense. This one is essentially more like it's moving in with you without killing you. It becomes essentially a parasite of your cells, but such a small one that you hardly ever notice anything. But we thought, okay, if that had a certain gene or another gene, maybe it could cause cancer. So that was very heavily financed, and many of my colleagues, including me, were elected in the academy. Some of my colleagues, not including me, got even Nobel Prizes for it. At least 6 or 7 were given for viruses as causing cancer. And the trouble was we couldn't prove in even one case that a virus is causing cancer. The primary prediction would be cancer would be contagious. You by sex or what have you, needles or kisses or scratching or biting or have you, or having the same spoon or towel, it would be enough. That's how viruses move. And there's no evidence that this happens. We have plenty of cancer patients, but no evidence of contagiousness. So slowly that sunk in after all sorts of Assad's hypothesis, and it couldn't be kept. So this club, the virus cancer researchers, to which I belong, we're now looking for other explanations. But of course their primary perspective was, could we find another virus? Because that's what we know how to do. And Carlo, with a keen sense of politics and science, he said, okay, I have one. I have a retrovirus. Now it's causing AIDS. And that was a popular claim because AIDS was unspoken for. There was no medical orthodoxy or establishment say, wait a minute, we have said it's this and this, we fight you to the end. No, there was nobody to speak for it, and nobody even wanted to touch it. It wasn't a very popular disease to begin with. And so Gallo said, to hell with it, we claim that one, at least we have something for retroviruses, so we wouldn't be in the archives of virology 50 years ago. We would be in the textbooks, and we would be the poster boys in the field. And most retrovirologists fell for it, and overnight it was announced by the National Institute of Health in '84 that this was the cause of AIDS, before we had ever seen a paper. And nobody said a word against it. The New York Times immediately, faithfully copied it. And as we know now, their offices are staffed with people from the Centers of Disease Control. Altman is a veteran of it. And that is true for the science editors, writers of many leading journals, San Francisco Chronicle included, in the Los Angeles Times. They all love microbes as a cause of AIDS. You can write about horrible stories, you can write about condoms, about vaccines, and about orgies and parties and drugs. That's much better than saying, okay, here we have a behavioral disease, we have to blame these boys or the girls, if it's girls, for their lifestyle, and these are chemicals, and we need guns, and we need gun control and drug control, which, as we all know, is not very popular in America. So here we go. And we had a virus accepted overnight by the leading heads, leading guys in the field, like Temin and Baltimore and Ramos and Bishop, all Nobel Prize winners like now for viruses that supposedly cause cancer, and saying, okay, we go for it, and we don't say anything. So there we are. And that's a very difficult thing to revert. Once you have a Nobel Prize and Alaska Award and all these things, and the money is rolling, you cannot have another enemy or another cause for the same thing and say, we give you money for another cause. That is not popular, certainly not at the NIH, and certainly not nowadays. I mean, they all study cancer now in the mutation theory, and they call it AIDS and virus theory. If you do anything different, you get nothing. In fact, it's worse than that. You become excluded, and you.
What is your belief that AIDS-defining illnesses are caused from?
Belief doesn't matter, Gary. The facts are, it can be, as you already explained or begin to explain now, it is very closely correlated with drug use, recreational drug use, and now, better than anything, with antiviral drugs. That Celia already mentioned briefly. I heard her briefly. She probably said even more. But anyway, these drugs are inevitably toxic that are now given against AIDS virus. They are designed to kill human cells, to terminate DNA synthesis. They are actually chemotherapies developed long before AIDS to kill human cells, and that's what they continue to do. And that's, I think, the major. Half of all AIDS patients nowadays are diagnosed or dying from diseases that are not even in those 30. They're not AIDS-defining diseases. They're dying from heart, kidney, and liver failures.
Yeah, so, that's true. That's quite true.
They shouldn't even be called AIDS patients, but anything when there's HIV, nobody asks anymore, or doesn't dare to ask anymore.
Okay, well, let me do a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
In one particular study, more than 20 men who had died from AIDS had semen examined, and they couldn't find any of the HIV virus in their semen. So if AIDS is the cause, if the AIDS virus is the cause of AIDS, and if these people died of AIDS, well, where was the HIV?
It was nowhere. See, they looked in the blood, even in the blood. What do they find? Maybe in 1 out of 500 T cells, which are supposed to be the primary target of this virus, you find one latent provirus, as it's called. That's the DNA that the viruses make when they replicate, and that typically is designed to sit in the cell for the rest of your life, and it can even be transmitted to your offspring. That's the most common biological transmission of HIV, is mother to child. And mother to child works pretty well. In Africa, where it's supposed to be extremely common, the African population has more than doubled since HIV, and 30% of them are supposed to have it. And the same here. Retroviruses are typically transmitted from mother to child. And that is a prescription against any disease. Nothing can be transmitted from mother to child biologically in the long run, that is inevitably fatal, as I say about HIV. They never want to talk about that for that reason. They always talk about heterosexuals and syringes and drug users. But the natural transmission mostly is mother to child, and nothing ever happens. And it hasn't happened in millions of years. These viruses are all millions of years old. Not one of them is new. We have them in chicken, in birds, in snakes, in fish, in monkeys, in humans, in sheep, in horses, anything. And none of them have any diseases from it at all.
Hold on, Peter. Back to you, Celia, before we go to Clark. Is it not the case, Celia, that we've had a virtual epidemic in the 1980s and 90s of sexually transmitted diseases in the younger population, as well as unplanned pregnancies, and yet we have not had a corresponding increase in HIV infection and AIDS in the same population group, which should show that if it's a sexually transmitted diseases, you should have an equal number of AIDS diagnosis in those who are diagnosed with
absolutely. There's no correlation between there's no blue line between sex and AIDS. Prostitutes, porn industry, rock stars, highly promiscuous politicians. Sex per se, you don't see AIDS cropping up, immune deficiency cropping up, unless, as you noted, there's also tons of antibiotics, recreational drugs, other stressors, malnutrition, and so on and so forth. Can I take a moment and circle back to something that you asked a minute ago about what happened? Why didn't this blow up as mainstream news? What was going on in the bathhouses?
Yes, please do.
Because there's a history there that I just realized as I was listening to you. Wait a minute, I know exactly the answer to this. I was inducted into this story by Michael Callan, who you also knew. Michael Callan was maybe the only person who was kind of an ambassador who came out from the hardcore bathhouse culture as a gay man, a bottom, who also believed in telling the truth about that culture. That was very rare. He teamed up with a man named Richard Berkowitz, who was also from that culture and was his good friend, and physician Joe Sonnabend, who was originally essentially a clap doctor, is now known as an AIDS physician who has been on different sides of the fence of this issue. Those three, in the mid-'80s, decided we have a catastrophe and we have to sound the alarm, and they wrote a series of kind of like samizdat pamphlets. Some of these were published in the New York Native to great alarm, and the one that I remember most vividly was called "We Know Who We Are: Two Gay Men Declare War on Promiscuity." That was Callan and Berkowitz. They sent it out, and they basically said, we are killing ourselves, we know how we're doing it, we know why we're sick, we know what goes on. And Joe Sonnabend played the role of the doctor who said, and I know why you're sick, because I treat you every day, all you guys, for numerous STDs. And basically this can't go on. This is a health catastrophe. And AIDS had begun at this point. What happened politically was I was in the apartment, the Chelsea apartment of Richard Berkowitz, who I have known for many years. This is about 8 years ago. And he showed me he put a videotape in his videotape player, and he said, I'm going to show you what actually went down. And it was a CNN interview. One side of the screen was him, Richard Berkowitz. The other side was Larry Kramer, famous founder of ACT UP, firebrand activist and gay political icon. And what they were battling over the issue of, is it right or is it wrong to tell the truth about the promiscuous bathhouse culture? And you can imagine who won. The Berkowitz-Callan team were saying, we have to. If we don't tell the truth, we won't get to the answer about why how to cure this, how to cure it meant stop these behaviors, abstain, sober up. Kramer came in and really, I saw the tape, just crushed it like a big lion. He just crushed it. He said, we will have none of this. no way. We've just come out of the closet. We've just had Stonewall. We're not going back in there. We're not having mainstream America view us this way. We are shoving this under the carpet, and we're locking it away, and you will never mention this again. And that's what took over. And then you have political correctness, like the water the culture was swimming in. And, forget it. And then they demonized very successfully. They equated discussing this with raging homophobia. You're a homophobe. And once that was done, you know how political correctness operates. It makes it impossible. So it became impossible after that point.
I would agree, because on Pacifica and all of Pacifica's stations, even to mention that there were causes of AIDS-defining illnesses other than this virus, you would be demonized by ACT UP. But yet when asked to come on and debate, they wouldn't. When I tried to arrange for the head of ACT UP in San Francisco and in New York to come on and debate Peter Duesberg and to debate some of the other outspoken scientists, they would refuse. They wouldn't come on. And yet they work behind the scenes where the program directors say, don't touch AIDS. Well, that's like 9/11. If you're an architect or an engineer and you have a concern about the official report and you find that it's defective and you go to say something, suddenly you're a 9/11 denier. You're no longer a patriot. This is the kind of nonsense that's gone on. And the left has led this smear campaign, and it's left everyone with the idea that all we have to have is another fundraiser, another march, another walk, another quilt making, and more money. Well, there's been $800 billion spent, and what do we have to show for it? And we've had over 69 different research projects on the vaccine that would be the one that would cure. What do they have to show for it? And we're right back to where we started. So I'm saying that, do we have the courage to look for the truth? Now let's go over and say hello to Clark Baker. Hi, Clark.
Hi, good evening.
Clark, give us your input on what you see as far as the HIV. You get the test. If you're positive, you're put on the drugs no matter what your state of health. And now, even if you don't have a virus, if you're HIV negative, they still want you to go on the drugs. And do they have any proof at all, in the scientific peer-reviewed literature, that putting people on these antiretroviral drugs will extend the life or improve the quality of life?
Well, there's a lot of propaganda out there, and it's difficult to sift through all of it. And as a criminal investigator, I once I identify something as propaganda, I pretty much ignore it. The first, I'm not a investigative reporter. I'm a private investigator, and I've investigated a lot of criminal cases. And the pharmaceutical industry in the past 3 years has spent $10 billion to settle thousands of criminal and civil complaints related to the illegal marketing of drugs that kill or injure between 2 and 4 million Americans every year. So by any standard, such an organization would be considered a criminal enterprise. So this is a remarkable moneymaker, a remarkable scam, and I look at it from a criminal standpoint. When I was first looking at the evidence that you're talking about back in 2008, 2009, I contacted the CDC and the NIH, and I asked them specific questions, and I kept getting responses from social marketing websites like air.org and Edelman. I could never get a response directly from the government agencies. And when you go back to the government agencies and look at their disclaimers, they tell you, they admonish the reader not to trust third-party websites. So the U.S. government, the NIH, the Health and Human Services, they're contracting with third-party websites that have no obligation to tell the truth. And the disclaimer on the government website says, don't believe them. So so when you read the literature that comes back from the social marketing website, and you actually take the time and look through their information and ask them follow-up questions, eventually they get tired of you and they say, well, go ask your doctor. Well, if you know where the doctors are getting their information, they're getting it from the same place that I looked, and other medical, pharmaceutically funded websites. So, but as far as drugs, and let me just talk about one drug, one of the top-selling HIV drugs today. It's called Atripla. It contains three main components: efavirenz, tenofovir, and Truvada. Efavirenz is a highly addictive psychotropic drug, and I'll get back to that in a second. The other two drugs cause bone reduction, fat redistribution, immune reconstruction syndrome, kidney failure, lactic acidosis, liver failure, and myopathy, among other diseases. So basically, if you never have sex and you take these drugs, eventually you will acquire an immune deficiency syndrome and you will die. The third component is efavirenz, also known as Sestiva. This drug, I've got videotape on our website, omsj.org, that shows kids smoking it like crack cocaine. Now, I've arrested over 2,500 drug addicts when I was with the LAPD. I've physically examined them, I interviewed them, and I processed them. And I've evaluated lots of different street drugs. But efavirenz, the symptoms appear very much like a hypnotic, like LSD. And so, but this drug, it doesn't seem to have any therapeutic treatment. It's there for enforcement, as an enforcement mechanism, not unlike the way nicotine was used by the tobacco industry as an enforcement mechanism to perpetuate addiction. So you start taking this drug, and after a couple, 2 or 3 weeks, you're addicted to it, and there's a lot of side effects that it causes when you first start it. But once you start taking it, if you interrupt the use, the withdrawal syndrome from this drug produces the same exact symptoms that AIDS clinicians use to identify the onset of full-blown AIDS. So, and you will get sick. Once you're addicted to this stuff, if you stop it, you'll get sick. And you go in and you say, Doc, what's wrong? I'm really sick. He said, well, you stopped this drug. Here, try it again. And you immediately recover as miraculously as a dry drunk who is given a martini. It's the same thing. Now, Atripla has, in the last quarter, reported October 2012, their sales went up 8% from $794 million to $865 million in just one quarter of last year. And if anybody ever gets caught, nobody goes to jail. So, in order to get straight answers from the HIV experts, I created the HIV Innocence Group. Since 2009, we have investigated and helped in the defense of dozens and dozens of people who were accused of HIV-related cases. And when we look at the medical record, it's clear that the physicians who alleged that these people were infected never conducted a diagnosis at all. And there was, in most cases, there was no evidence that a doctor even attempted to make a diagnosis. However, many of these doctors received kickbacks from Bristol Myers Squibb and Gilead, which is the maker of the components in Atripla. And coincidentally, both of those pharmaceutical companies are currently the subject of multi-state whistleblower lawsuits where sales reps are reporting up to $100,000 in kickbacks to physicians who unnecessarily prescribe these toxic drugs to their patients, to their otherwise healthy patients. So this is criminal behavior.
Okay. Clark, we got that message, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. Back to you, Celia. Celia, look at all the different people who profit from AIDS. The 75,000 foundations, $800 billion spent around the world. Look at the doctors' reputations. Look at the news media that have supported this failed hypothesis. Look at all the legislators who were only too happy to support this. What is the likelihood that anyone's going to be able to tell the truth, since you would, in effect, have the entire scientific and medical community excoriated in the biggest medical scandal in history if they had to acknowledge that everything that they said about AIDS was wrong, and they killed all these hundreds of thousands of people with drugs for a condition that was not. Could have been handled completely differently, as any of the individual conditions would have historically been handled.
I don't harbor the fantasy anymore that it will come down like the Berlin Wall, that there will be I can't see how it would. There is no press. There is no media. The media has been utterly complicit. There's an alternative media where this truth is basically known. So I think we have to ask the question, where? Where is it going to come down, and where is it going to keep going as this loathsome racket, deadly racket, which is probably not just a racket, but almost certainly is tied in with, I was going to say population control, but really the word is population reduction. I don't know if that's the end game. I don't know what this is about besides the money. But it's as dark gets, and unlike with former totalitarian and fascist regimes and systems that were psychotic and deadly, but they weren't financially explosively viable like this. This thing is a destructive, deadly failure that keeps simultaneously hemorrhaging and producing money, enormous money, gargantuan money, in a system that Clark Baker probably understands better than anybody on the planet right now. I think what you asked me specifically is, what are the chances for it to come? The chance for it to be revealed in the truth revealing times that we are somehow in, paradoxically, even though we're in this horrific time of darkness, it's causing people in numerous ways to work harder to pull up the truth. There is a total disassociation in trust and faith with the mainstream media. Now, I don't know anybody who thinks that they're in the business of revealing truth of any kind. So that's good. That's the good news. I'm trying to stick to the good news. That the edifice will somehow collapse or crash, I can't see it. It is possible that individuals like Clark Baker and his team will drive that wedge where it will hurt them legally in the courts, such that it will flip and no longer be financially viable or be a catastrophe if class action lawsuits begin to be successful, which I think will happen.
Okay. Dr. Duesberg, as someone who was at the very beginning challenging the HIV equals AIDS hypothesis and suggesting that recreational drugs, the amyl nitrates, and one man alone that I interviewed and followed, and he invited me, said, come and look. And they loved their lifestyle, but this one man was using up to 22 amyl nitrates per night. On top of that, cocaine. On top of that, 1,000 milligrams of penicillin, drinking, smoking, staying up till 4 in the morning. He started healthy. His immune system was shot, and within a year. And I said to him once, you realize that if I took the healthiest Olympic athlete in the world and gave him your regimen, in a year this person would be dead. And he just laughed about it. And so I realize that no one's going to tell the truth on this. There can't be that truth. But you had to suffer because you look for the truth. Tell us about what it means in academia, especially at that time, not today, when the University of California, Berkeley, was considered one of the more progressive institutions, and yet you were dealt with, when I was there filming you and speaking with your colleagues, you were dealt with in a very, very almost medical McCarthyism way. Your thoughts?
It hasn't changed a lot. Yeah, it is. I was subject to a misconduct investigation a little over a year ago because of anonymous letters charging me with a global health threat by questioning HIV as the cause of AIDS. You are essentially, as a called a denialist, and the denialist is equated with a mass murderer and God knows what. So the president of the university took that up and set up a misconduct investigation. And half a year later, I was exonerated, but it's not the same as winning something. They say, okay, we can't prove anything, and you have still worked within, or have worked or functioned within academic freedom. So we cannot see any reason for criminalizing you. But at the same time, the paper we had published around that time in Medical Hypothesis was censored, was taken out by the big publisher Elsevier.
We're having a little trouble hearing you. We're coming up near the end of this particular broadcast. Let me just summarize a few thoughts for all of you. And again, you're listening to Clark Baker, a retired officer of the LAPD who has been a private investigator and has taken on many of the challenges and helped exonerate a lot of people in their HIV court cases. Also, Celia Farber, award-winning reporter on this, and Professor Peter Duesberg, a molecular biologist at the University of California, Berkeley, who, as you heard him say, even though at one time Dr. Duesberg, the man you hear on the phone now, was considered one of the top scientists in America. He was one of the top people at the National Academy of Sciences, published in hundreds of peer-reviewed journals, and only when he challenged this HIV equals AIDS hypothesis did it all stop for him. Today, we're going to go to Vienna in Austria and speak with Dr. Christian Fiala, F-I-A-L-A. He is a gynecologist and obstetrician based in Vienna, and earlier he had extensive medical experience working in Africa and Thailand. In 2007, he established the Museum for Contraception and Abortion, the only museum of its kind. For 20 years, he has critically followed the scientific and peer review and political debates on the epidemiology of AIDS. He was a member of the Presidential AIDS Advisory Panel in South Africa and currently sits on the board of Rethinking AIDS. He's published many papers on the problems of AIDS in Africa and the definition of AIDS, and is the author of the book, Do We Love Dangerously? A Doctor in Search of the Facts and Background to AIDS. Nice to have you with us again.
Thank you for the invitation.
I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure is going to take quite a little time to answer, but please take that time. Back in late 2008 or early 2009, Dr. Andrew Mathias and Charles Geschechter wrote an article suggesting that the way AIDS is being handled in Africa, including giving high doses of AZT or similar drugs, is an iatrogenic depopulation strategy, meaning that the actual drug is leading to and causing death. I'd like for you to address that. And also, can you share anything about the work of the German physician, Dr. Klaus Köhnlein, who's been treating AIDS patients for over 10 years without AZT or its related cousins? Could we begin there, please?
Well, yes, thank you. It's really my pleasure to contribute in an evidence-based way and looking really at the facts and analyzing the facts regardless where they may lead us. And one of the underlying problems is what do we mean when we talk about AIDS? Most people will probably not be aware that the definition of AIDS... Yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Most people will probably not be aware that the definition of AIDS is artificial and has been changed repeatedly, and it is very different from one continent to another. Especially the definition being used in Africa has nothing to do with the definition being used in Europe, and there's quite a significant difference between the definition of AIDS being used in the States and that one being used in Europe. So when we talk about AIDS and the clinical treatment, medical treatment of AIDS, we have to keep in mind that we are actually talking about very, very different things in different locations. In summary, what all these definitions have in common is that they are remake of old already existing diseases. So diseases that have been out there since ever, like cervical cancer, like pneumonia, have been renamed, relabeled as AIDS under certain conditions. So what we actually have is we don't have new patients. That is, we don't have patients with a new disease. We just have patients with diseases which we know very well, which have been out there since ever. Only we give them a new name. And together with this new name comes a new treatment approach. And maybe this is what makes the difference between Dr. Köhnlein and many other AIDS specialists, that he looks at the patients and their symptoms and the underlying diagnosis, and he treats patients according to their clinical diagnosis, not according to a relabeled new definition which has little meaning and has produced so far no beneficial clinical treatment.
A larger question, if you would. Thank you for that answer. When I look at Africa, and I've studied AIDS in Africa from the time it was first diagnosed as being an epidemic there, we're told that it's infectious and it's sexually transmitted, both. And yet, in all the countries, and I went through every country in Africa, I went through all their medical statistics, and what I find is that very wealthy individuals, industrialists, heads of banks, diamond companies, they don't have AIDS-defining illnesses. When I look at medical doctors and look at the professional class, lawyers, professors, CPAs, architects, accountants, they don't have the AIDS conditions. When I look at the upper middle class bureaucracies, they don't have it. When I look at the when I look at the business mercantile class of business owners, they don't have it, and most of your bureaucrats don't. But then you have this large divide, and over the other side of the divide, you have poverty. You have people who don't have good nutrition, who don't have clean water, who are caught in civil war and who are in migration, who live in refugee camps, and there you have large numbers of people diagnosed with AIDS. Now, if it's sexually transmitted and if it's infectious, then everyone in Africa, from Egypt and the other countries in northern Africa, should be just as susceptible to those in Middle Africa or Southern Africa or Ecuadorial Africa, and they're not. So how is it that what we're calling AIDS seems to be very definitely related to a person's socioeconomic and health conditions?
Well, if you look at the definition of AIDS, especially the definition for Africa, and it is really important to keep in mind that WHO defined and published a specific AIDS definition only for Africa in 1986, the so-called Bangui definition. And if you look at this definition, it becomes so obvious that what we call AIDS in reality is a relabeling of poverty, diseases, poverty-related diseases. And so it is no surprise that even in Africa, those people who are said to be suffering from AIDS are mostly those suffering from poverty. And it is kind of a cheap excuse for the West to say, oh no, these people, they are not suffering from economic poverty, which might be changed. They are suffering from their own sexual drive, which is without any medical basis. And it is really scandalous that we as the West, we don't support people in Africa, poor people in Africa, to get out of their poverty, like helping them to get clean drinking water. Instead, we make them believe that it's their own fault, they are suffering from these diseases, and we are giving them highly toxic drugs, which will just make things worse or even kill them, and which is really cynical. And I think it's unprecedented that we try to overcome poverty with highly toxic drugs. This will never work, and it will never help people on the ground to get out of their poverty and the problems associated with poverty. We need to be reminded that poverty is not a romantic issue. It's really a struggle for survival, and really survival is a question of living and death. So it is actually quite cynical, our approach of AIDS, especially in Africa. And on a more general level, I think it is really striking to see that the last 20 years we have seen a lot of predictions, a lot of announcements on HIV/AIDS, on vaccines, on epidemics, on death, on mortality. And if you look at all these, if you remember all these predictions, they have one thing in common, that is they prove to be completely wrong. All these predictions were completely wrong. And I think it is really high time to re-evaluate and rethink what we call HIV and AIDS in view of this impressive failure to fulfill these predictions. Because if these predictions did not come true, then obviously the underlying assumptions were wrong. And I think we really need to revise these underlying assumptions.
Good. Then let's do a follow-up to that line of thought. With AIDS, you're given a blood test to test for antibodies. And if you come up positive on this, there's a confirmation backup test, and then you're immediately put on medications as their first line of defense, and one of the most popular medications and most heavily used was AZT. Now, is it not true that there are over 75 separate conditions, pregnancy being one, arthritis, herpes, tuberculosis, malaria, among these that will also give you a false positive reading, and also the symptoms that they define a person is having AIDS without even doing a blood chemistry are virtually the same as a person who's malnourished, suffering from malaria or tuberculosis. They're virtually indistinguishable in the symptoms, and wasting away, a non-productive cough for a month or more, having yeast overgrowth. And so looking at a person who is that sick because they cannot afford or do not have access to anti-malarial treatment or tuberculosis treatment or nutrition, they could be given with a devastated immune system, one of the single most toxic drugs ever created, so toxic it was not allowed to be used on patients in cancer chemotherapy because of its toxicity, yet that's the drug that's used. And instead of stopping and saying, hold on a second, why don't we simply try giving this person good health, the medicines that would normally be used to treat tuberculosis or malaria or whatever it is, instead of the approach they're taking? Your thoughts on that, please.
Well, you're completely right. One of the big problems and actually scandals in HIV/AIDS is the non-respect of evidence. and non-acceptance of evidence. It's really driven by hysteria and thoughts and ideology. And the HIV tests are a very good example, because the HIV tests actually, they don't measure the virus, the actual HIV. They measure antibodies, which are supposed to be directed against this HIV virus. But as you mentioned, there are so many clinical conditions like vaccination, like pregnancy, like malaria, like other diseases, which lead to a positive result in this HIV test and make it very difficult to interpret. And even if you look at the product information, the manufacturer of the test, they go even further. They are going further. They don't talk about false positives. In the product information, you can read, for example, in one of the in the product information of one of the biggest manufacturers of HIV tests, you can read the citation. At present, there is no recognized standard for establishing the presence or absence of HIV antibodies in human blood, end quote. Now, this may sound harmless to you, but imagine you would be a woman missing her period. You would go to a gynecologist and he said, well, I can make a very reliable pregnancy test, and you would read the manufacturer's brochure to that pregnancy test, and the manufacturer would write in this pregnancy test, at present there is no recognized standard to verify the presence or absence of a pregnancy in human body, end quote. Would you still believe your doctor who claims that this pregnancy test nevertheless is very reliable? And would you believe the result of such a test? You would probably run away and be scandalized, and you may even go to court, bring this doctor to court for malpractice, because how could he possibly do a test on you when apparently there has never been a recognized standard on how to interpret the result of this test. So this comparison with a pregnancy test just indicates and makes it understandable for everyone to see how basically unreliable these tests are. Even the manufacturer admit that they have no idea how to verify the accuracy of their tests. So if the manufacturer has no idea how to verify these tests, I, as clinician, I feel I should not do such a test on my patient. And if I would be a patient and a doctor would do such a test on me with such a claim in the notice, in the product information, then I would sue my doctor for malpractice, regardless whether this is a test on HIV or on pregnancy. So as long as we have not solved this underlying basic question, what do we measure with HIV tests? As long as this is still an open question, it's absolutely useless to continue any other discussion, or let alone base any clinical treatment on such a highly unreliable test.
Appreciate the answer. Just one more important question for your experience in Africa. We are told that it's mainly sexually transmitted. We've been given all kinds of strange scenarios that truck drivers will pick up a prostitute, get infected, and then infect another prostitute who will then infect whoever they're having sex with, and that's how this happened. And yet, all the studies have shown that porn workers in the United States having millions of sexual episodes over the last 25 years without protection, you didn't have any of the AIDS-defining illnesses. Also, in Africa, people who were measured, who were prostitutes, who acknowledged being prostitutes, there was no epidemic of AIDS or AIDS-defining illnesses or HIV infection in these women. Also, in a clinic there, it would take orphans, AIDS orphans, and instead of giving the AIDS orphans, all of whom were going to die, and all were suffering from malnutrition, instead of giving them AZT and drugs, the doctor running the clinic instead gave them medicines they actually needed for their real medical conditions, and good nutrition and clean water, and they all ended up being healthy. None ended up having AIDS. And yet you would have thought that that would have drawn some interest from around the world, from the media, from the medical community. So none of these anomalies, taking HIV, AIDS diagnosed kids, all of them, reversing their AIDS by simply giving them good, wholesome food and water, clean water, and proper medical care, and they are all natural, normal, and healthy. And yet no one looks at these as being significant. Your thoughts, please.
Well, I think this HIV/AIDS discussion really points to a basic problem in science, that science to some extent has become a belief system and is not based on facts, verifiable facts, and an exchange of the best arguments. Instead, some beliefs are spread, and people are forced, and scientists and clinicians and doctors and media are forced by economic means to spread these beliefs and to reiterate them, even if they are completely wrong and verifiably wrong. And the examples you just gave are just proving this point. HIV tests are known to be fundamentally unreliable. It's not that they are just slightly unreliable.
All right,
in
let's
some
take that
situations.
Further. What have you found is the number one cause of death in people who are defined as having AIDS?
Well, all this depends on on which continent you are, and in which there is a huge difference between the States and Europe, and there's an even bigger difference to Africa. In Africa, the main problem are poverty-related diseases. That is malnutrition, respiratory tract infections, gastric infections. These are the main health problems of people in Africa, and they have not changed over the time, and there is no indication, not a single indication, that the health problems in Africa are related to a virus, that they are transmitted, and there's absolutely no indication that the health problems of people in Africa are sexually transmitted. On the very contrary, even in addition to the examples you gave on the States and in Europe, where we don't find female prostitutes, female sex workers being at risk for HIV, where we don't find an epidemic in the general heterosexual population. Even in Africa, if you look at the epidemiological data, there is absolutely no indication, in fact, for a sexually transmitted infection. In fact, there is evidence to the contrary. There's evidence that HIV-positive tests are not related to sexually transmitted diseases. Like in most countries, when they do HIV tests, they also do a syphilis test. So syphilis is a well-established STD, sexually transmitted disease. Strangely enough, there is no correlation between those people who have a syphilis infection and those who are positive in an HIV test. So if syphilis is well recognized STD and there is no correlation, so you take regions in Africa where with a high rate of syphilis, would you find a low rate of HIV tests? And in the other hand, you take a region with a low rate of syphilis, you find a high rate of HIV prevalence. And even over time, we found a reduced frequency, reduced prevalence of syphilis, and a claimed increase of HIV, for example, in Africa. But I also did these epidemiological studies in Thailand. So actually, you find a geographical inverse correlation between syphilis and HIV, and a chronological inverse relation between HIV and syphilis. So this clearly is a proof that if both are infections, they cannot be shared or transmitted by the same mode of transmission. They have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
In the United States, during the 1980s and 90s, we were told that the next giant wave of HIV-positive people would be in teenagers because of unprotected and substantial amounts of sexual activity. Indeed, we did find an increase in unplanned pregnancies, herpes, 1, 2, and 6, gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia. We did not find HIV infection in the same group of people. So if HIV is sexually transmitted, and is supposed to be easily transmitted, then we should have seen it proportional to the increases in sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancies. We did not. So, but when you check intravenous drug users in the United States, people whose immune systems are completely shattered, people whose blood is a toxic sewer with all forms of viruses, including hepatitis, which will also test you positive, there we are supposedly getting into the mother lode of HIV infection. Yet if I take 1,000 IV drug users who are 19 years old, I'm going to have a high percentage test positive for HIV, and a certain amount will have AIDS-related symptoms. If I take another 1,000 teenagers, same age, and who are non-drug users, I'm going to find none, zero. And so none of these are about sex. It's about the immune system. And
Exactly.
then are they going to say, well, HIV only infects intravenous drug users? The logic behind how they position this is simply so astoundingly foolish, and yet an entire $800 billion paradigm is based upon it. So here is my question. Knowing that we have people who've staked their entire careers, some people are now in the 25th year, a quarter of a century of living by feeding off the AIDS hysteria. You have at least 2 million people who've worked in the AIDS field or are related to it. You have gay foundations, you have labs at major universities, you have whole federal agencies, you have the UN, you have pharmaceutical companies. It's not even possible, in my opinion, for any of these people, including the media, to ever acknowledge they got anything wrong. It's not possible for Science magazine, even though there was a petition to look at Robert Gallo's 4 articles and challenge them. So if the entire foundation upon what AIDS is and is not is flawed, then how is it possible for anyone at any level, from the gay activist to the media like the New York Times to Bono and Sharon Stone and the others who've supported AIDS fundraising, Elton John, to the pharmaceutical companies, to the foundations, of which there have been more than 75,000, to the clinicians, to the physicians, to the nurses, to the hospitals, all of them would be open for massive litigation. Class action lawsuits like we've never seen in world history. It would virtually break up the entire medical industrial complex. So how is it possible for anyone in the paradigm who's benefited off the myth to acknowledge complicity in this fraud?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's really a difficult question because the real scandal in HIV is that the evidence and the facts, the verifiable facts, are not acknowledged and not taken into consideration. Instead, we continue a belief system, and it becomes the longer this HIV theory takes, the more it resembles the former system of bloodletting. It becomes really very similar, and it is a tragic that one of your former president was killed by bloodletting. And this was a similar belief system which was also upheld by the medical society and the scientific society at that time. And so there are really more and more parallels developing between these belief systems. And I think HIV/AIDS is actually not a medical scientific question. It's a belief question. and we need to handle it as a belief system, like we had other belief system, like communism, for example, has also been a belief system which collapsed. And I think we have to tackle and confront HIV/AIDS as a belief system, and otherwise we need to wait until all those who have benefited from the system have retired or died away, until the new generation will hopefully reverse this belief system. But it's clear that all the scientific questions have been answered. It's a fraud. We have been disappointed over more than 2 decades. None of the predictions have proven right. In fact, all the predictions proved wrong. And the only solution to this is to re-evaluate all the data and to go back to basics. That's what we truly should do in science, and not what we are currently doing with HIV. Actually is mixing a belief system and taking it as a pseudoscience, and that will not be able to continue forever. Because it is wrong. It becomes more and more apparent that it's wrong, and people will simply not believe it anymore.
Christian, I'd like to tell you a little story, and then I'd like your response on it, please. In the mid-1990s, I had a gentleman come into our medical center in New York, the Tri-State Healing Center. And every evening, 7 days a week, starting at 5 o'clock and going till midnight, 7 hours, the only people who were being treated by the medical staff were HIV-positive, AIDS-defined, or ARC-defined patients. And word had gone throughout the gay community, it was principally gay, but also intravenous drug users and some hemophiliacs, that we used holistic therapy, and there have been very good results because many of the people within the gay community had been there. They had been helped and gone back and spread the word. Also, one of the leading medical doctors in the gay community was a man named Stephen Chiesa, and he had been working before the AIDS crisis, helping men with the unique conditions of anal intercourse, unprotected anal intercourse, and the immunosuppressive impact of sperm in the gastrointestinal tract, plus the problems of what happens when you lacerate or puncture the gastrointestinal tract, and then fecal material ends up in the body, and you end up with septicemia and many other very toxic and frequently fatal conditions. And he gave me a call, and I was working with Stephen for a long time. I would take his patients that he was using an aqueous-based vitamin A, which was rare, and he was treating people with syphilis, but I was doing the other work on helping them reestablish their immune competence by building up their immune system. A gentleman came in one day, and he said, I'm from California. I heard about you all, and I want to tell you a story. And I said, what is it? He said, over the last 12 years, I have been in no less than 20 support groups. Over 2,000 persons with AIDS were in those support groups. Some were small, some were larger. Every single one died. Not one was alive. I was the only one in these AIDS support groups that were using diet and wheatgrass juice and other things he was talking about. And he said, and I would be hounded. In fact, one group didn't want me there because when it came time to talk, I would talk about how better I felt and how my blood chemistry, even though my T cells were low, which was due to some drug use I had engaged in, but otherwise I was feeling great. And one time in Los Angeles at a AIDS support group, a fella from one of the ACT UP groups came and really berated me. And he berated me by saying, when you come here and you talk this nonsense and you're against the drugs, you could easily get people away from proven therapies, the drugs. So I said to the guy, can you show me anyone who's using AZT, DDI, DDC, protease inhibitors who are alive and well, equal to myself? And he said, of course there are many. He says, well, I haven't seen any. Can you show them to me? Point them out in this room. And there was a big argument. He was told to leave and not come back. And he said that he did go back, but he stopped going when the people died. So here he was in New York. Now, this was unusual because I'd never spoken with him or anyone like this, that every single person using the Orthodox approach, listening to the people from ACT UP, listening to those who were the hardwired, true-believing, cult-like mindset of Big Pharma's got the ticket, Big Pharma's got the answer, and all their patients dead. He was alive. So we put him on a holistic protocol, ones that he had not used. He had not known about intravenous vitamins, glutathione pushes, homeopathic zeolites, ozone intravenous or autohemotherapy. He was unfamiliar with all this. In a period of under 13 months, he seroconverted to HIV negative, but he was in a room with others, and the other people in that room all were making improvements. 12 of those individuals ended up reversing all their AIDS-defining illnesses, pneumocystis, cranial pneumonia, Kaposi's sarcoma, thrush, etc. And 16 months later, we decided to have a press conference. We invited, on 3 occasions, 7,000 members of the medical community and all the major press. We took out a day at the General Media Center on Broadway in the mid-'60s, and 100 individuals who had made improvement, and there were 12 there who I had personally worked with through the Tri-State Healing Center who were on my protocols. All those 100 people had their medical records, their medical doctors with them. We had a panel of outstanding physicians and academics, and so it started. Not a single member of the media showed up. Not one. Not a single member of the Orthodox AIDS community showed up.
I'm not surprised.
No one showed up, and yet it was widely publicized. Now, there was a chance if the American scientific community and if the American medical community and if the American media truly wanted to know about alternative approaches, they would have seen that we had the patients giving their own testimony. We had their medical records of all their blood workups and that show that they had the full-blown AIDS. Today, by different techniques, they came from all over the United States. It took a year to organize. But these people were all either in full remission or fully recovered or HIV negative, totally cured. When you don't have a single person show up. Now, photographs of that and the description are up on my website. So this isn't myth. You can see there's the AIDS banner. AIDS is not a death sentence. You can see the doctors. You can see the people. You can see them getting up and telling their stories. It went on for 6 hours because each person got up and told their story. And yet not a medical writer, a journalist, a governmental agency, not even when I'd personally called the head of the AIDS group in New York City for the city of New York, no one showed up. Now, that was the final wake-up call that the truth about AIDS will never be known. And my own radio station, to this day, advocates only the Orthodox approach. And for myself or anyone else who dared question the AIDS has some problems in its diagnostic tests and its treatment, in the foundation of the entire AIDS edifice. Look at the proof. Look at the number one cause of death in people with AIDS is liver failure, which is not one of the 30 defining conditions. It's definitely due to iatrogenesis or the drugs. They won't look at any of this. So that told the story for me. I'd like for you to address any of this as it might relate to your own experiences.
Well, it absolutely confirms my personal experience, and it points to the fact that we are actually not in a scientific debate. We are in an ideological fight. We are in a fight about truth, belief system, and we are still trying to prove that this is wrong. This is a little bit like going to the Vatican and discussing with the Pope about Virgin Mary and saying, well, being an obstetrician myself, I can confirm this story is probably not true because simply it's not possible. And then the Pope will probably try to be polite at the beginning and try to convince me to believe in this at least one Virgin Mary. And if I insist, and if the more and more proof I will bring, the more he will resort on a power play. And we have seen these kind of ideological fights in many instances. And just to give you one small example, in Vienna, there has been about 150 years ago a gynecologist called Semmelweis. And Semmelweis was an obstetrician, and he observed that maternal mortality in the delivery wards, which was run by gynecologists, by doctors, the maternal mortality was really very high. Up to 30-40% of women who gave birth died due to an infection. And clearly this motivated him to find the reason and a possible solution. Now guess what? The solution he found, which was very easy in fact, the solution was that he discovered doctors didn't wash their hands before they did a vaginal examination in women being in the delivery ward. So he convinced the doctors to wash their hands before they would do a vaginal examination. And because he was well respected, these doctors, they followed his advice, although they didn't really believe in him, in his theory. So as a result of this experiment, doctors washing their hands, maternal mortality, guess what? It dropped significantly to a mere 2 to 5%. So Semmelweis had proven that women died from infections being transmitted by the hands of doctors. Now you would suppose that they would praise him and give him all kinds of honors and of course oblige every doctor to wash his hands before doing a vaginal examination. Sorry to disappoint you, completely wrong. They not only kicked him out of the university hospital, the city of Vienna officially banned him from entering the city because for the simple reason he could not be right, because it was, and that was a quote of that time, the hands of doctors could not possibly transmit death, end quote. So this reminds me very much of the situation, the debate we are in currently on HIV/AIDS. This is not a scientific debate, not at all. It's a power play. It's an ideological debate. It's a small minority which tries to defend their budgets and their influence and their power, and to do so they need a belief system like Vatican or like the communists or like like the bloodletting or numerous other belief systems which we have seen. One recent belief system, by the way, which has collapsed very fast, was a belief system in swine flu. You remember, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, everyone was called to get a vaccination from swine flu, and it was only after 1 year that we learned that everything was faked, and actually there was no reason to get vaccinated from swine flu because that was not a specifically dangerous infection. So I think the solution to this HIV is to see it as what it is, and namely ideological power play, and we have to confront this power play not with arguments, as it is, because it's useless. It's useless to argue with the Pope about Virgin Mary. It was useless to argue with the Brezhnev about the communist system, and it was useless of people at that time to argue with them about bloodletting. It is a power play, and we have to confront that power play with the weapons used in power play.
Just a few more questions, if you would, please. At the height of this debate, there were only a handful of us. In 1983, 84. Today, there are thousands of scientists, journalists, physicians who are looking at the story and finding to their amazement just basic science has been abrogated, has been completely eliminated, and it offends them. And that's why some Nobel Prize winners in science, in the field of AIDS, have denounced the science of AIDS or its treatment. They're physicians who know that the treatment is worse than any condition. And yet, there's still 800,000 physicians out there and millions of scientists and bureaucrats, technocrats who go along with it, who don't want to be confused by any of the science. What do you say that it could help open more minds and have those several thousand that have come over to a more enlightened side do so?
That's actually the crucial question. How can we overcome this belief system? And sometimes I really feel like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov back in the times when they were locked up in Siberia by the former communist governors in Moscow. They fought a belief system named communism. And we are actually in the fight with a belief system called HIV/AIDS hysteria. And we have to confront this system as a belief system. And I think the best weapon against the belief system, and this is true for Virgin Mary or whatever you take, is to inform people about the facts and get to the people, discuss with them, and show them the basic facts, and so that they don't have to believe anymore or follow any belief, but that they can follow the facts and the conviction and really question what is happening and looking with their own eyes instead of following some claimed Führers which we have, who self-proclaimed experts who try to explain us the world. But this is really something we need to work on, and probably there is not a recipe yet how to overcome this ideological barrier and to overcome this deeply cynical and unscientific HIV/AIDS hysteria, which is not only doing really tremendous damage to those people who are claimed to be affected, but it also does a huge disservice to the scientific system, because actually it is it damages the scientific system, and we need the scientific system actually as a basis for our actions, because the scientific system should provide verifiable facts and best arguments how to solve problems, those problems we have on this earth. And if this scientific system is kind of hijacked by a belief system and misused, abused for this ideological goal, then the damage, the risk for damage is much further than just for HIV/AIDS. The damage is that people will not trust anymore the scientific system, and then the only alternative we have will be some new belief system, and belief systems will never provide any solution because they are only interested to get to finance themselves and continue in their belief system. But I would really, if you allow me, to kindly ask you to start such a debate. How can we overcome this belief system?
Well, the debate has been started, but each time that we try to debate, the people who hold the orthodox, full-fledged establishment view lose the debate, and hence they're afraid. They won't debate Peter Duisberg or Stefan Lanka from Germany, the virologist, or Dr. David Rasnick, or the people who really could show the truth of real science. They won't debate the physicians who treated the patients with holistic techniques for their original underlying conditions, more often than not hepatitis. So that debate's not going to happen. There's too much at risk. They're just going to they can slander people as they do, and especially ACT UP. They'll slander. I've been on the receiving end of that, and my audience knows the truth, so they could care less about what these little twerps have to say. But I've invited them on the show repeatedly. You know, don't be a coward. If you got an issue, come forward and debate it, and let the audience decide. They won't do that because they know that they would just be handed their ass on a tray. It's that simple. we don't lose because we have truth on our side. They won't even go into that fight. So they're cowards. They try to run up behind you and sucker punch you. Mm-hmm. But stand toe-to-toe in a debate, national debate. Let's see who comes out with the facts on their side. I can bring a lot of people who are fully recovered from AIDS. They can't. Mm-hmm. We can bring scientists, physicians, nurses who can show you the truth of how people have been falsely diagnosed. We can bring you people who were completely healthy but had hepatitis and given a diagnosis of AIDS and then put on antiretrovirals, including DNA terminators, and it nearly killed them. And the only reason they survive is they stopped the drugs. They can't bring you fully recovered persons. They've never had one. They'll promise you a vaccine. They've had 69 times that they have had vaccines supposedly going to do it, and not one has worked. So that's how it works. One last thought, and this is my last issue with you. I saw how down and dirty these people played. So what I did was this. I was invited to be the keynote speaker at a gay lecture in New York, where all the men and women there were gay men and women. And that's fine. I support gay rights, so I went. And I was giving them a talk about staying healthy, especially at a time when just being gay was considered to be enough grounds to consider you suspect for being a person with AIDS. And so I asked, how many people in here are vegetarians? All these hands went up. How many are vegans? Hands went up. How many of you take vitamins and juicing and meditation and supplements and exercise? And all these hands went up. Then I said, okay, now we're not talking about a few people, not a few hundred people. The room was packed. I'm going to guess 600, 700 people. I then said, how many of you have been tested for the HIV virus? All these hands went up. How many of you tested positive? None of the hands were up. So then I said, well, how many of you have a lot of sex? All the hands went back up. So I said, well, now this is kind of an anomaly since it's supposed to be sexually transmitted. And if you've had all this sex, and if you're gay, then you should be. And a man stood up at that point, and he said, Gary, he said, I've been listening to you since 1975. And he said, I got to say that maybe you're not aware of it, but there's 2 gay communities. I said, well, I'm not aware of it. Please educate me. He said there's the fast-track gays who live a very, very open and cutting-edge existence. They take a lot of drugs. They have a lot of sexual partners. They're up all night, and they work all day. And then on the weekends, they'll go out to Fire Island or to a club downtown. And then there are the regular gays who, outside of their sexual preference, are just regular human beings, but you wouldn't know from their lifestyle that they're any different than anyone else. And the people in this room are very conscious about health. So he suggested that I go with him for a period of time down to the fast-track gay bars on Christopher Street. So I did. In fact, I went for almost 2 years. I interviewed over 2,000 people, almost all gay, within the fast-track community. I saw things like there are trucks there, and at nighttime, across the street on Christopher Street, on the docks, on the river, there'd be these empty trucks, and you go over and you look inside, and you'd see all these cigarettes lit, but you couldn't see anyone, and people go in there to have sex. But when you stepped on the floor, your feet, your shoes would feel all this crunching. These were amyl nitrate capsules. I mean, there were hundreds. And people would regularly use amyl nitrate or poppers under their nose so they could extend their sexual high, especially after they'd already had one orgasm, so they could have 10 or 15 or even 20 sexual experiences a night. I saw in one of the bars a man who had a clear jar, and he was a physician, and they were 500 milligram penicillin. And people took them like candy because the word was, if you take a handful of these, you won't get any diseases. Not true, as you know. Taking an antibiotic will not prevent a sexually transmitted disease. And then I saw the alcohol, smoking, cocaine. I saw their lifestyle, and I got to know 2 of the guys who were roommates. And when I first met them, they'd only been going there for about a month. And every night they would go there. And they were having lots of sex, drinking, partying, and they would finish about 4 or 5 in the morning. They would go home, get an hour or 2 of sleep, and then go right in to teach. At the end of 2 years, both of them had AIDS-defining illnesses. They both died. They took their drugs. They took the antibiotics. They had only bad bacteria. The good bacteria were wiped out. And then their immune system was simply collapsed. And yet I saw this over and over again. And when I talked to them, why are you doing this? One of them said it best. He said, because it feels so damn good. And the fact that you can go out and live your sexual fantasies every night is just phenomenal. And this is part of what Stonewall, right up the street, the nightclub, sexual liberation. It's our body, our right. And then at that time, I was counseling some fast-track heterosexuals known as swingers, people with wife swapping. And they were having amyl nitrate. They were having unprotected sex, and they were having AIDS-like symptoms. But because they weren't gay, they weren't given the fast-track drugs like AZT. They were given antibiotics. So they recovered from their sexually transmitted diseases. But had they been gay, they'd been dead. So there was my dilemma. So now because of that lecture, and because I was told about the difference, but because it was politically incorrect to say there's two groups of gays, the fast track, which is about 2%, and the rest were completely normal, regular people. But they didn't have the AIDS in any statistically significant amount. But that was also true of heterosexuals. You had the fast-track intravenous drug users representing under 2 to 3% of the population. They're the ones with AIDS. You had the fast-track swingers. They're the ones with AIDS-defining illnesses. And yet the vast majority of Americans didn't participate, either gay or straight, in the sexual revolution. But that was what I found. Your final thoughts on this?
Well, that is what I have also observed, and there's a very nice film, you probably know that, gaysinthe70s.com.
No, I haven't seen it. No.
Website, gaysinthe70s.com, is a film on exactly what you have been telling about. And it comes to the point, if you break it down, I mean, it's the basic fact that if you want to live a healthy life, you have to live a healthy life. I mean, you can't kind of live an unhealthy life and still hope that your body will deal with it. You live an unhealthy life, you will have to bear the consequences of an unhealthy life. And I'm not saying that in any moral background. It's everyone's own decision, whatever kind of life he wants to live or she wants to live. I have absolutely no moral objection, and I completely understand if someone wants to live multiple sexual exposures in one evening. Fine, I have no moral comment to make on that. But then if this person is living an unhealthy lifestyle, he can't or she can't blame the consequences of this unhealthy lifestyle on others. And we have that not only in gays, we have that in cigarette smoking, we have that in obesity, we have that in alcoholics, we have that in other drug users, not only poppers. All these people, they live an unhealthy lifestyle. Fine with me, no moral judgment to make on that. But if there is a health consequence, and I'm saying that purely as a doctor observing these people, if there is a health consequence caused by this unhealthy lifestyle, well, you can't blame someone else for the life you led.
But do you see how easy it was to blame a virus? And yet the people who were sick had hepatitis B as many as 3 times in a single year. Syphilis 4 to 5 times near the people I interviewed. And no one seems to want to know the truth of all that. Thank you very much. We're out of time. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you for having me as a guest, and good luck with your show.
Thank you.
And have a look at the film Gay in the 70s.
I will.
Very, very good. It's just documenting what you have been telling.
Dr. Christian Fiala, F-I-A-L-A, my guest. He is a board-certified gynecologist and obstetrician in Vienna, Austria. Extensive medical experience working in Africa and Thailand. and he is published in peer-reviewed literature. He was on the Presidential AIDS Advisory Panel in South Africa and currently sits on the board of Rethinking AIDS. He's published many papers about the problem of AIDS in Africa, and the book is also very important as well. I'm Gary Null. Thank you all very much for listening.